policy is about creating an enabling environment for people to thrive. Now, a lot of businesses in Uganda and in Africa are in survival mode. Policy-driven interventions have led to, mark my words, led to 74% of what was read in the budget was influenced by private sector. And the driver for that was PSFU. Wow. So we are a very influential body. So influence is our hallmark for policy and advocacy to create an enabling environment for businesses to thrive. Uganda is the youngest nation in the world. Right. We are now approaching 50 million people. The average age in Uganda is 17.6, right, which means that we have a very dependent population. Now that's both good and bad.
No, I'm excited. I mean, I like the fact that you mentioned the youth and women, because this program, one of the things we're trying to promote is to see how faith-based institutions, the private sector, can address the issues of women and youth. And as you mentioned, Uganda, almost about 75% of the population are young people aged below 30, 35, which is key.
We don't have access to the sea like many African countries do. So people call us landlocked. For us, we see that as an opportunity. So we call ourselves land-linked.
Who is Mr. Stephen Asiimwe?
Thank you very much, Doctor, and it's a pleasure to be part of this meeting. Stephen Asiimwe is a Ugandan. Right. I'm married to Molly Asiimwe, who's a member of parliament for my sub-region in the southwestern part of Uganda. Okay. We have 2 sons, Shaba and Shiloh, and God has been faithful to us. Wonderful. I have close to 33 years of work both in government and private sector. Okay. My background is education. I'm a social scientist. Okay. But my passion about 20 years ago was in the area of media and publishing.
Wow.
So
this is not new to you?
No, this is not new to me. But one of the things I noticed about the media is a very big buffet, if you like. Right. But I noticed that the media largely concentrated on politics and social events. But my first intervention in the media was in the area of business, trade and development issues. Okay. So I was a business editor, I was a business writer, I was in research, and I noticed that the media, both print and electronic, concentrated on very much the daily issues, politics, society, entertainment. Information was, if you look at the bulk of what goes on in the media space, it is largely focusing on the political and social events. The business is not so much a big deal. So I decided to concentrate on that area. Okay. One of my seniors and mentors at the time, Mr. James Tumsime, was the editor-in-chief of Uganda's largest newspaper, now the biggest media house, called the New Vision Group. Okay. But back then we were only involved in print. Okay. So he used to say, in business, you find the gap and you market the gap. So the gap, in my view, was that the business and development issues were not very much on the spotlight. So I had a 10-year stint from very junior level until I became business editor. Okay. Then at that time, Uganda, you're looking at between 93 and 2003. Okay. That's quite Uganda is part of the East African community, which is one of the largest economic groupings. Back then there were 3 countries, now we are 7. And there was a lot of integration discussions going on, largely spearheaded by our president. And at that time, the president of Tanzania, the late Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, had passed. But there had been that push for an integrated East Africa, to be part of an integrated Africa. So I felt that there's need, since we were growing into the East African community, to create a media house that would speak to opportunities So I and a group of friends left the comforts of the media houses, put our resources together and started something called the East African Business Week.
Right.
So the plan was, and the idea was to create a business enterprise and information that would propel regional integration.
Absolutely.
And then our view was then to propel this into an African vision. So I did that for another 5 years from 2000. No, actually it was 10. It was 10 years from 2004 up to 2014.
Right.
So I published a newspaper called East African Business Week. So initially it was Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania.
Right.
So when Rwanda and Burundi were admitted, I got them on board. But we had a very powerful strategic neighbor called Ethiopia. So then we spread it into Ethiopia and we became 6 countries.
Right.
And we're largely focusing on trade, investment, ICT, agriculture, business, and all these things. And our catchword was, our motto was unveiling opportunities.
Oh.
Business people want to see willing buyer, willing
What's
seller.
happening in that
So once that was done, I felt the Lord getting me into an area which I had observed that one of the best things that we have as Africa, as East Africa, and in particular Uganda, was tourism.
Okay.
Tourism is about an experience, and things are experiential. So experience is in 5 senses: the touch, the smell, the sight, the taste,
Absolutely.
and
hearing.
the hearing. And Africa is the best place to visit.
Absolutely.
We have over 1,000 languages and tribes.
Absolutely.
We have cultures, we have templates, we have all sorts of things. So I joined government as the CEO of the Uganda Tourism Board. And I can tell you it was another experience because we wanted to attract Uganda to become the favorite destination. So I did that for 5 years. And that took 5 years. And so at the end of that stint, I had done 30 years in both private and public. So I decided to go on a sabbatical leave for 1 year.
To cool a bit.
To cool the weight and to reflect on what's my second term.
Right. And also to enjoy the little money that you have made, I guess.
Well, yes, in a sense, yes. Travel around the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I did, by the way.
Which is important.
I visited all the continents.
You did that too.
And I ended with a pilgrimage to Israel,
Oh, great.
which had been my top on the bucket
Wow.
list.
Fantastic.
I got some revelation then, and then it coincided with COVID. But something else happened in my family. My wife got a revelation to go into politics, to serve.
Okay.
So at the end of the sabbatical, I was thrown into the deep end of politics. And after 6 months of hardcore campaigning in the grassroots, my wife emerged the winner. And so as a family, we have a member of parliament in my house. So I used to sit on the left, now I sit on the right, because in Uganda, the big people sit on the left. So that's my story in a brief.
So this is interesting. I mean, it's obvious that you've had such a exhaustive career in not only in government but also in the private sector. No wonder now you are the chief executive officer of the Private Sector Foundation. Now, tell us a bit about Private Sector Foundation. We're particularly interested in that particular role because this program is about religion or faith-based institutions and enterprise development. And as you know, in Africa, largely employment is created by the private sector. Now we're talking about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the Agenda 2063 and all of that. And I'm so excited that, your business, the Enterprise Business Week was not only focusing on Uganda, but with East Africa and then eventually the Africa. So probably you guys started talking about Africa Continental Free Trade Area even before the concept was developed. So tell us about Private Sector Foundation. And I am interested in knowing exactly what you do and how you have impacted and helped build the SMEs, the MSMEs in Uganda, and the effect of that on the economy of Uganda, and vis-a-vis what it has also impacted on the East African economy as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, the Private Sector Foundation is a member-based organization.
Right.
It started in 1995. It was started by a group of business people who wanted to create a special purpose vehicle for ensuring that private businesses can essentially influence policy. Policy is about creating an enabling environment for people to thrive. Now, a lot of businesses in Uganda and in Africa are in survival mode. But if you look at the blue chip companies in Europe and America, they've been around for hundreds of years, some 50, some recent. But the level of organization is largely driven by government creating an environment. Businesses will thrive anytime. And business have been here for thousands of years. So in 1995, the Private Sector Foundation was born. And it was a co-creation of both private sector and government. So we're about 27, 28 years old now. So from 11 business associations, we've now grown to over 320 now.
Wow.
So all the top corporate companies, SMEs, but we are largely association-based. And we are
membership-based.
It's a membership-based under 12 sectors.
Right.
So you have manufacturing, agriculture, ICT, tourism, logistics and transport, education and health. You have trade, you have professional services, you have financial services, and you have oil and gas, minerals and extractives. And recently we moved into the creative sector. Now, we are premised under 4 mandates. The first is policy and advocacy. So we work a lot with government to ensure that laws and policies are done. In fact, to that extent, our policy-driven interventions have led to, mark my words, led to 74% of what was read in the budget was influenced by private sector. And the driver for that was PSFU. Wow. So we are a very influential body. So influence is our hallmark for policy and advocacy to create an enabling environment for businesses to thrive. Wonderful. And how do we do this? You have both the hard and soft. So the hard is cash, logistics, hardware, but the soft parts are things like ICT, money, and there are innate things that we do like business development services. Now, Uganda is the youngest nation in the world. Right. We are now approaching 50 million people. The average age in Uganda is 17.6, which means that we have a very dependent population. Now, that's both good and bad. A consumptive population versus a productive population is a very dangerous proposition. So what we do is now PSFU is pushing for a policy intervention in especially the younger generation. Okay. So 75% of our 50 million people is below the age of 35. We have advanced very fast through universal primary education, free secondary education, to the point that now we are producing over 1 million graduates a year. Every year. But they are not entering the production workforce, the productive workforce. So we create avenues and catalysts and enablers, facilitators towards that generation through training, skilling, financial management, and looking at opportunities. So that's the second thing. We are in business development for the business community, from startups, the micros, the small, the medium, into the large. Right. The third thing we do over and above business development is skills and capacity building, again, for the youth and women in that strata. And we skill them into vocational work, into agriculture. Uganda is a small country, about the size of Ghana in Africa.
You mean the land mass?
Yes, in terms of land size. Sure. If you are European, I would compare it to the United Kingdom. If you are Central Europe, we are the size of Romania. Right. If you are in the US, it would be the size of the state of Oregon. And it's in the middle of other countries We don't have access to the sea like many African countries do. So people call us landlocked. For us, we see that as an opportunity. So we call ourselves land-linked. So we have South Sudan to the north, we have Kenya to the east, we have the DRC to the west, we have Tanzania, Rwanda and Burundi to the south. And we are sitting in opportunities right in the middle of Africa. Now, Uganda again is blessed to be one of the countries with the highest concentration of water. So over 30% of our land mass is covered by water. Lakes, rivers, mountains, streams, and now that makes us a very productive country. We are high altitudes in many places. We actually have snow on the equator. We have volcanic soils, and we have an educated workforce. Right. So most of the Ugandans are educated. So that is a very good opportunity for us. So as PSFU, we say, how do we harness all of that to create a productive population that has an advantage of being land-linked? With the coming in of the DRC now, East Africa has about 400 million people. Yeah. And for the first time, the East African community is connected from sea to sea. We have the Indian Ocean on the east and the Atlantic on the west. Our vision is to see the whole of Africa connected with railways, with roads, with airports, with high-tech ICT facilities, and to be an African continent on the move. So Uganda, from where we sit, stands in a pivotal position to be, one, the biggest producer of electricity, because we have hydro. We are in the middle of the world, on the globe, on the equator, so we have 12 hours of sunshine. We can produce all the electricity we want using sunshine through solar power. We have water, volcanic soils. So we are essentially, potentially, the breadbasket of the world. Educated workforce with very beautiful scenery. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be a lender and not a borrower of resources. So the private sector is vital. So with that in mind, our view is to create the best economy in Uganda, create a productive workforce of Ugandans, but also to create a very interesting place to attract foreign investment that can then be able to service. So PSFU is pivotal in that. And so in so doing, our fourth mandate is to create partnerships with every institution, all and sundry. Absolutely. So we have the World Bank, the EU, the MasterCard Foundation, all these development partners as our partners. We work with universities because we believe that academia and industry must work together. Absolutely. But more importantly, we are targeting youth and women because that's the next engine of growth based on the factors that I have mentioned.
Good. No, I'm excited. I mean, I like the fact that you mentioned the youth and women because this program, one of the things we're trying to promote is to see how faith-based institutions, the private sector, can address the issues of women and youth. And as you mentioned, Uganda, almost about 75% of the population are young people aged below 30, 35, which is key. But I must commend you, the fact that you've been able to play that advocacy and policy role by ensuring that your budget has almost about 75% of it driven by the private sector. Now, that brings me to my next question. With all that you've done, and obviously, like you mentioned, I like the fact that you have Africa, in scope. In 2015, the Lord spoke to me and said, the world is going to gravitate towards Africa, and it's going to start from Uganda. And that's why we're here. So my question is, what can other nations on the continent learn from Private Sector Foundation Uganda? Because if you travel to a lot of countries, I was in Malawi recently, they don't have a private sector, foundation as it is. They have the Chamber of Commerce and all of that. But listening to you, the role you are playing is so vital. What can other nations on the continent learn from you? And how can they do the learning? And once we think about that, with all that you are doing, poverty seems to be on the rise. So how do you link the two? I mean, you're doing so much with the private sector, businesses seem to be getting a lot more from government in terms of the advocacy role that you're playing. But how come, and you mentioned you are a very educated population, but the youth still are struggling, at least having been here for over 6 years? Where is the dichotomy? Where is the link?
I think that's
so the women and youth issue first,
yes,
and then the African thing. I know it's a lot loaded questions. Then we come to the employment side of it.
Right. I think that one, of course, the fact that we've been growing. First of all, our philosophy is that we look at the business first.
Right.
A business must be successful. And for a business to be successful, there are basic tenets that must be managed. Number one, your financial situation, your management, your resource mobilization, and all the factors that pertain to creating a successful business.
Right.
Frugality, taxation, etc., etc. And is the business running on an opportunity, or is it, a wave? There's a tendency that people run into business before actually planning. So we believe that we must have a very successful business. But that business must be operating in a context of other businesses.
Right.
So that's why we encourage many people to be part of an association. Linkages. So if you're, let's say you're in coffee, which is our biggest export, you must be part of the coffee value chain. You must be understanding what sort of diseases are being affected, what best practices are used for farming, how do I get more value for my coffee. So if you're part of a coffee consortium, then it helps for us as PSFU to intervene. So we actually encourage small businesses or whatever to be part of an association. Now, those associations then form part of a sector. So you have coffee here, cotton, sugarcane people, milk, dairy producers, poultry, who are part of an agriculture sector. So strong individual businesses, right, strong associations, strong sectors. When you have a strong private sector, then you have a thriving economy.
Absolutely.
So we go that way and backwards. Right. So a strong economy is based on a strong private sector. Strong private sector is based on a strong association. Strong association is based on a strong individual businesses. So that is the way we look at the context of intervention. Right. So as PSFU, the reason we've been growing and where people can learn from us is based on those basic interventions. The strength of the individual, the association, the private sector, and then which translates into the economy, and then backwards. Right. Now, when the government wants to increase taxes, they would ordinarily go to organized businesses. So one of the challenges we've been facing is a lot of businesses which have been formal going into the informal, and so they are not traceable, there's no whatever. So those are basically the things we look at. But going into the next question, which is basically the African context. Absolutely. Is the need for African countries to work together. So if you look at the colonial times, essentially we had about 5 countries that came into Africa. So the British, the French, the Germans, right, Portuguese, and a few, maybe 1 or 2 few countries, the Spanish. What were they doing? That was the post-industrial revolution. They needed raw materials. So they came in here, introduced, crops that would feed into the industries back home. Now, for a long time, we have been surviving and in the thinking mode of the colonial and post-colonial era. Now, what has happened is there's been a distortion in the global economy. What do I mean by that? We went for a trade mission in South Africa at the beginning of the year. South Africa is 4 hours away from here. Right. And I went into a cafe and I asked for coffee. And I asked this guy, yes, and I was served coffee from Germany. Now, Doctor, they told me, I was very curious to know why the South Africans were serving me coffee from Germany. Germany doesn't grow coffee, neither does South Africa. We grow coffee. I was shocked to learn that actually that coffee came from my country. Yeah. So we grow coffee, export it to Germany. It is processed and sent to South Africa.
Absolutely.
And I am the Ugandan who grew the coffee. It's possible that coffee was from my samba. So for me, that dichotomy is a failure on the part of the Africans.
But it's also a rude awakening for you.
Absolutely, yes. So we immediately got into the discussion and then decided that, no, we are going to export coffee to South Africa, and vice versa for many other products. So I think that in the context of Africa, the need for Africans to talk to each other, I guess we went to Ghana and we were surprised to find that there were Ugandan flowers which had been flown in from Amsterdam.
And they were grown from Uganda?
And they were grown from Uganda, shipped to Amsterdam and brought. But therein lies issues of connectivity, air travel. So I think that there was a phase in which Africa had its success story, colonialism, post-colonial era, but now with the advent of telecoms and technology, and the need for us to have a discussion on the table and the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, I think now is the time to start talking to each other and do business together.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Which is very critical. And I'm happy that, you've had the practical experience in terms of what. Now, that takes me to the changes that have taken place in the global, economy. Now, from where you sit, and of course, from the standpoint of business and private sector, how would you describe the current global, business economy? And what do you think Africans can learn from these global changes that have taken place? And what do you consider to be the main challenges to the private sector and also business development in Africa?
I will begin with a spiritual concept first. I think that the Lord is telling us in Africa that this is the time for Africa. I think that every continent has been given an opportunity. And to the extent of our relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ, is the extent to which revelation is coming our way.
Absolutely.
What do I mean by that? In the book of Genesis, there is a famine in Canaan. And something happens in the home of one of the patriarchs in the Bible, a man named Jacob. Had a son called Joseph, and the story unfolds in him being sold by his brothers, and he finds himself in Egypt. And there's a story of a dream of the lean years and the years of plenty.
Absolutely.
And basically, Egypt becomes the center of the highest production in the land in preparation for the advent of what was going to be a major catastrophe. If I borrow parallels from that discussion, I would like to suggest that there is a crisis in the world.
No doubt.
That crisis is telling us in Africa to prepare to take advantage of that situation. Egypt in the Bible represents Africa. And I think that if you look at the challenges that are going across the globe, the wars and all sorts of things, you actually see the need for us to come together. We have a place in Uganda called Karamoja. It's in the northeastern part of Uganda. In terms of land size, it's about the size of Belgium, or in the African context, about the size of Rwanda or Burundi. That place has easily some of the best minerals. It has waterways, it has mountains. Recently they discovered that it produces it has the best conditions for wheat production. And if we were able to grow wheat on a mass scale, we could actually feed the whole of Africa. Wow. There's a crisis in Ukraine and Russia. Yes. What's the lowest common denominator? Wheat. And fertilizer. All of that is provided for in Karamoja. But we have not exploited. Why? Africa suffers from one problem, mindset.
Mindset, absolutely.
And until and when we change that mindset issue, we are in this purview of confusion and deliberate disintegration. That is why the AfCFTA, in my view, is probably the best thing that people like Osajefo foresaw in the 50s about a united Africa. People like Nyerere, people like our current president, Yoweri Museveni, who believe that a strong and united Africa. Africa has the highest concentration of lithium. But 99% of the batteries that are a product of lithium come from another country after being sold to us. Everything, tin, iron ore, everything. Absolutely. We export raw materials, and then we are importing. We have an interesting analogy in Uganda. On the highway, there are one road, but one section of the road has bumps. The other section is very flat and very comfortable. The reason being that most of the things coming from the sea are heavy-duty manufactured products. And on this side, which is the export side, is taking raw materials which are very light. So that tells you one thing, that we need to change the way we think, plan. Absolutely. Most of our banking systems are foreign, telecoms are foreign, everything. But I'm glad that that's beginning to change. Right. I think that the experiences in West Africa, where fully fledged oil refineries are owned by Africans. In Southern Africa, we are seeing people taking over mining projects which are Africans. We are seeing banks, insurance companies, universities. There's going to be a mindset change to deal with this dichotomy. And I think that the time is now, and we are in the driving seat of that new vision.
Well, I mean, if you have just joined us, we are having a very interesting conversation with the Chief Executive Officer of the Private Sector Foundation, Uganda. And the focus of our discussions have been how faith-based institutions and private sector private sector in Africa can help drive the Africa Continental Free Trade Agenda and the Agenda 2063, the Africa We Want agenda. And it's been an exciting conversation with the Chief Executive Officer of the Private Sector Foundation of Uganda. Mr. Asiimwe, let's go back to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area issue that you have just raised, because I think that to a very large extent, Africa, as you mentioned, this is the time. And the dreams of the Nyereres, the Kaundas, the Osajifos in those years, 50, almost 60 years ago, now is becoming life. So with the advent of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which everybody seems to believe is the biggest dream of a marketing block that Africa has been able to fashion out. But you and I know that the success or failure of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is going to be largely determined by you guys, the private sector. And yet, like you mentioned, the private sector in Africa is fragmented. You are not talking to each other. So can you outline 2, 3, or 4 point outlines that you suspect if the private sector in Africa takes, it will help drive the agenda? And, you know, you have been in this, you know, just as a Chief Executive of Private Sector Foundation in Uganda, which you've done a fantastic job, but you've been a private sector person yourself, you know, and all of that. You've seen it all. What, in your view, are the 2, 3, 4 point steps that the private sector foundation, private sector in Africa ought to do? Of course, you mentioned the linkages and the associations. What else can they do together?
That's a good question. First of all, in East Africa particularly, we are part of the East African community. Right. We have one headquarter in Arusha.
What is a we?
Uganda is part of the East African community.
Of course.
We are 7 countries,
sure,
part of the East African community. Right. It's called the ESC. Right. East African Community. We have a secretariat, which is based in Arusha. Now, that is the secretariat that is executive leadership. You know, you have a secretary general, representative, assistant secretary generals from the 5, 6, 7 countries now. The East African Community Secretariat sits alongside the East African Legislative Assembly, which is basically the parliamentary side, right, which passes laws.
Yes.
Within that consortium is something called the ESCJ, the East African Court of Justice. Right. And then we have many, many other groups. Now, the Private Sector Foundation is the apex and umbrella body of the private sector in Uganda. In Kenya, it's called KEPSA, the Kenya Private Sector Alliance. In Tanzania, It's called the Tanzania Private Sector Foundation, TPSF. In Rwanda, it's the Rwanda Private Sector Alliance. In Burundi, the bigger group is the Burundi Chamber of Commerce. In the DRC, it is a group called the FEC, which is a French acronym for Federation of Business Enterprises. And then in South Sudan, they have another group, the South Sudan Private Sector Group. Uganda was the first to go private sector. And because of that, the World Bank used us as a benchmark and helped the other countries to be part of this discussion. So we led the way in terms of creating a regional grouping of private sector players internally. However, for us to grow and to ensure that our mandates, which are pretty much the same, policy and advocacy, we then created the East African Business Council, which is a private sector group that brings us together. And from the East African Business Council, we are then able to push for regional policy advocacy.
Wonderful.
Now, that has helped us to push the East African community to give laws and procedures that support those things like non-tariff barriers, removal of customs. We have an integrated customs union. We now have a one-stop border post, OSBP, which essentially means goods do not have to delay at the border. Many years ago, it would take 8 hours for a truck to clear. Now it takes less than 1 hour.
So once you clear that from that border, you can go through.
You just go through. You don't need to check with two borders.
Interesting.
It's one-stop border post. But we've done so much through the EABC, and where we have problems, and we do that through the EALA, East African Legislative Assembly, Parliament. And where we have challenges, we use the East African Court of Justice to adjudicate. So the point I'm pushing here is that you need strong private sector, create strong regional private sector, push policy to create that enabling environment that will then make the region thrive. That's why the ESC, in my view, has been the most successful regional grouping. We've moved very far. We are about to start an East African Monetary Union. So we'll have one currency in a few years, Doctor. Now, once you have a strong East African community, you then have a strong COMESA, which is Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. Then you have a strong ECOWAS in West Africa. Then you have a strong Maghreb. Then you can talk of a very strong African Business Union. Now, one of the things that we have achieved, for example, is that because the heads of state have their summits every time, we have pushed for a position where the EABC, the East African Business Council, which comprises all the private sector apex bodies, meets the presidents to push for a business agenda for the region. And that way, we are then able to create a very strong AfCFTA, because business people speak one language. Business, we are here to make profits. Of course, businesses compete, and countries are competing. So you have a rise of what is known as NTBs, non-tariff barriers, protectionism, selfishness. I mean, business people are selfish, or if you like, self-interested people. But we then create a very strong agenda. And for me, at the head of this side of things, and the vision that we have, I'm able then to say, these are the policies that are going to be able to sustain us.
Interesting. So I mean, it seems to me East Africa is doing quite a lot. But the question I'm putting to you is, are you talking to the other regional bodies, like the ECOWAS, like the SADC, like the Aramu people? Why is it taking such a long time? I mean, Africa Continental Free Trade has just taken off, but there are still some teething problems. So the question is, and as we have already alluded to, this is going to be largely driven by the private sector. Are you guys talking to your colleagues in the other regional blocks?
Absolutely.
And what has been the main challenges, if you don't mind?
Again, we have to give credit to process. Since 1963, when the OAU came into existence, the Organization of African Union, now AU, so much has happened, so much water has passed under the bridge. I'll tell you, for example, Doctor, that PSFU is the focal player at the Ugandan level with the EABC, the East African Business Council. But we are also the focal person at the COMESA, which is a grouping of over 25 countries. Now, for us to be able to forge that discussion, we've now started talking as apex body to apex body. We've now met the apex body of South Africa, BUSA, the business South Africa. We've talked to Ghana, we've talked to Nigeria, we've been to Algeria, we've been to Somalia, we've been to 16 countries of Africa, and we are talking to the business people. And I can tell you it is already winning us good friendships. But secondly, Doctor, is that as PSFU, we have now begun a very serious and protracted discussion. We are saying that every time our president is visiting a foreign country in Africa, he must go with business people. So that you have a political summit standing and working alongside a business summit. And this is, we innovated here. Absolutely. We have also said, when a visiting foreign president is coming to Uganda, he should or she should come with foreign business people. So we have an engagement. We want to move away from wine and dine to a serious discussion. Number 3.
Like that.
We are saying...
That is not to say that when the president, the politicians be doing wine and dine anyway. We need to put that in before they think that...
They need to know that whatever they are wining and dining with is produced by the private sector.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes, yes.
Number 3 is we have now shaped foreign diplomacy from the traditional, again, wine and dine. Right. And we are saying we want to be the main partners for commercial diplomacy. So that our embassies abroad, our missions abroad, must not be largely for political purposes, but they should push the economic agenda, which is to create markets and opportunities for the people they are representing in that jurisdiction.
Wonderful. This is good. I mean, and I need to commend you, I mean, for your leadership and all of that. There's no doubt that you are doing quite a lot. Thank you, sir. And this is something that is commendable. And I like the fact that it's not business as usual any longer. And Africa is actually on the move. So let's come back to the issue of religion and faith-based institutions. As you can see, we believe that Africa is the future of the world, and there's no doubt about it. Yes. Now, if you look at Africa, largely almost about 99% of Africans are religious. In fact, it said that one of the researchers, they said that to be an African is to be religious, and to be religious without being an African means that you're really not an indigenous person from the continent. So most SMEs, put it this way, most entrepreneurs are either in the mosque or in the church. So from where you sit, what are some of the critical roles, if you like, that you think, with all that we have talked about, Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the changes taking place at the global level, the Africa 2063 agenda and all of that, do you see any critical role for faith-based institutions in this project that Africa is embarking upon?
Absolutely. I'm a Christian, yes. So I'll draw parallels and lessons from the Bible. The first assignment in the book of Genesis were 3 things. God told Adam, he told man, be fruitful, increase and multiply and subdue the earth. What was he basically saying? He had given in the book of creation, we see the Lord creating the land, the sea, and the air, and then the creatures therein. So basically he was saying, exploit this, multiply it, and not just multiply yourselves. But we see God saying he created man in his image, in his likeness. Absolutely. God is a business person, or a business deity, if you like. And God is in the business of multiplication. It's in the business of growth. Business is about growth. It's about exploitation. Positive exploitation, not negative exploitation. Absolutely. Now, what's happened is that if you look at the book from Genesis to Revelation, whenever there was a misuse of the land, so for example, stone or trees were supposed to create furniture and create infrastructure to help us to be able to be productive. When you convert a tree into wood and the wood into very good furniture, it sells at a premium. If you then misuse that wood and create an idol, something which someone can worship, then you are actually displacing the original intent that God has put in that facility. If God gave you trees for beauty or whatever, and you destroy them and make them into charcoal, there's a self-destructive mechanism. You are destroying the earth, and you're going to bring climate change.
Absolutely.
So what am I saying in short is that I think that the church or the religious institutions have not understood the role of religion. The role of religion was supposed to be a catalyst to that end game which God has said, be fruitful, subdue, and multiply. In fact, in the Old Testament, the Bible is very clear. The priests were not supposed to do business. They were supposed to earn from the land, what is known as the tithe. Their work was to give spiritual guidance to people to worship God Almighty and to move away from the idols that people were carving out from wood or stone or whatever it was, metal, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Now, I think the moment the church or the religious institutions lost that mandate, you have a self-destructive mechanism. But where they understood the basic tenets that God had put in place for that enabling environment to do business, they thrived. And that's why America, for a long time, thrived, because the pilgrims who left Europe and set foot on the land, immediately, America is now the top producer of everything, from technology to agriculture to space to whatever. Now that, because they've lost it, in my view, there's a self-destructive mechanism, and it's just something to watch with space. But Africa, in my view, has almost the most religious environment. I think it's important that the religious institutions, or the faith-based institution, if you like, understand their mandate, help to catalyze that, and then people will basically be inspired to do better through revelation. Right. Because innovation, in my view, is revelation. Right. Which is then put into practice, and then it brings something in place. Right,
right. So in a sense, if I get you right, you agree to the assertion that faith-based institutions have a critical role to play in transforming the mindsets of Africans to be more business-like and all of that. Let's drive it home to, let's make it a bit more concrete. Today we are talking about technology. Yes. We're talking about computers, artificial intelligence, and all of that. Do you see any role of faith-based institutions, or religion, so to speak, in all of this? I mean, you mentioned innovation. You mentioned the fact that God created the world and made sure we are supposed to follow him and do certain things. Jesus Christ, said you can cross the sea not just by using the boat. Sometimes you can even walk on it. That's innovation. If you want to produce wine, it's not that you have to grow the grapes and all of that. Sometimes you can just... So my question is, when it comes to technology, when it comes to innovation, artificial intelligence, and I'm asking this question because, as you know, largely most young people in Africa are very religious. And today they are very technologically oriented, but some are also using it to destroy themselves. What advice do you give to faith-based institutions, particularly entrepreneurs, to the extent that faith or religion can be the pivot around which all these technology inventions can play to advance business development on the continent?
That's a good question again. I probably should have mentioned that along the way, many Christians felt that business was not their place, and therefore they left it to quote-unquote secular players. My example is that Christians need to move into very influential places because they carry both the practical professional side, but they also carry the spiritual and inspirational side of things, because there's something about every new idea comes by revelation. Now, I believe very strongly that the church, which is basically a community of people coming together, should, over and above the element of preaching spirituality and faith should then encourage people in, again, chapter 1, fruitfulness, multiply and subdue. And that's where technological elements come through. And therefore, I think that it's important that young people are inspired to dream, to create, and to put in place technological advancement or innovation. And if you look at the history of education, the printing press, the word kindergarten came from a church. It was a children's garden. It's a German word for children's garden, where people were taught. But who was teaching? It was basically mothers who were working in churches where refugees had run. And that's where every biggest industry began in the church, the hospitals. Hospitality emerged from that because people went to churches for counseling, for healthcare, for protection, for security. The Industrial Revolution began around the church area because it was only the church which could talk. John Gutenberg, the printing press, that guy was a priest. So I think that we've lost that original Industrial Revolution. The Renaissance actually began around the church. People got revelation on education, on the printing, on technology. And I think along the way it got lost. Now it's time for the church to reinvent itself and bring back those facets that began around that revelation. And therefore I think that this is the right time for religious institutions to start inspiring and allowing people to be creative and use what God has given them as a revelation to then be able to do that innovation that should be taking place.
First, you've mentioned that Uganda has a very young youth population. Statistics show that by 2050, Africa is going to be the largest producer of labor force for the whole world, which is something that cannot be argued about. And as we've already mentioned, most of these young people who are going to become the labor force by 2050 are in the church or mosque. Are you concerned about the religious pluralism that we see on the continent and how some faith-based leaders seem to have lost the original mandate and in the name of so-called prosperity gospel? Yes. Now, I mean, let's be serious about this. Are you concerned about the religious pluralism that we see on our continent today? And against the backdrop of the fact that we are talking about the fact that many Africans are in church, and yet the continent seems to be the only promising continent for the world now. Are you concerned? And if we're concerned, how do we address these issues?
Again, it goes back to the fact that people have not understood the Bible and God's plan and God's original intent. Again, Genesis chapter 1 says, be fruitful, multiply, subdue. If we broke down those facets into the real... So fast forward, in the New Testament, Paul is concerned. Paul was a lawyer by excellence. He'd been a priest and he'd persecuted the church. Sure. Paul notices along the way that you need to use your hands and your mind. So Paul, along the way, got a skill in the area of tent making. Right. So when he was not preaching, he was making the tent to earn some money. And even the money that was sent to him was not for his own use. It was actually to support. And
he was bold to tell the people of Corinthians that we didn't come and feed on you. Exactly. We didn't even ask for anything from you. Yeah, sure.
And if a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat.
Yeah.
The prosperity gospel, in my view, is really a opium of the mindset. Because you're telling people to give. You're not telling people to work. There's no work. You must work. You must use your hands. You must use your God-given brain. And I can tell you, Africa is full of talent. I mean, at the Private Sector Foundation,
you see them.
We have had to create a sector for the creatives. Ugandans and Africans have some of the best humor. Absolutely. I mean, you sit there and you just laugh. Absolutely. That's a business. We have people like Trevor Noah. Right. Trevor Noah is a young man who's a comedian, started off in South Africa. Right. He's now rated #1 in the US. Musicians, you can see the power of music from West Africa, and Southern Africa. DRC for a long time dominated the airwaves. The creativity, if you go to West Africa and you see the Kente, the Agbada and all of that, incredible. So who is dominating the catwalks now in New York and Paris and Ottawa? It's the African people. So everything in Africa, everything by Africa is essentially a seller. And from sport, we have, the black race is the fastest race on earth. Everything from 100 meters, short distance, middle distance, marathon. Uganda has been beating many of the marathons. Kenya, Ethiopia. West Africans are very good with the middle distance. So we have some of the best talent, but again, it goes back to the issue of mindset. But we also have one weakness: we are not united. Right. Secondly, we see a lot of selfishness, and the church can break that curse. The church is responsible for bringing unity. The religious institutions, the faith-based institutions are responsible for everything in terms of guidance. Right. So again, if you look at the Renaissance, after the Dark Ages, the church became the center of education, of health, technology, even business. It was because of the church that land distribution and fragmentation, which pushed people away from the land into the towns and created the Industrial Revolution. Cities and urban centers were born because of persecution. People were persecuted on the land, they came into towns, and then ideas developed around the church. The church was the focal point. That is why, Dr. Deitumi, every country in Europe, or maybe I'm being too much, most countries in Europe, they have a cross on their flags. It was basic. The lighthouses, the churches, the church had a place on top of the hill, and it was the cross of Jesus Christ, which is the place where we all get our redemption and direction. So therefore, we need to come back to that cross, that center of excellence, that center of direction, and who is responsible for that? The people who are in the leadership of the faith. But who is the church? The church is you and me. Absolutely. I am a business leader in my right, and I have accepted Christ as my Lord and Savior. I have every right to speak in the spiritual realm of the business mountain and inspire young people, women, old people to be able to be part of a business intervention. And once we can bring all these people together, then Africa will be united, because we are one body, one spirit. There's no reason why we cannot become a successful continent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's been an interesting conversation, Mr. Asiimwe, and I am very excited and very passionately inspired by your optimism about Africa and all of that. But let me ask one last question, or maybe last but one. There's been this, if you like, old adage that Christians are not supposed to go into politics. Now, you just said a while ago, when your wife, I think when you guys were in Israel or whatever, your wife had a revelation to go into politics and serve her people. How is she doing? And would you accept or admit that Christians, looking at the issues that you are doing, the role you're playing, policy, advocacy, and all of that, is it important for Christians or faith-based? Muslims are doing it, already taking over the political dominance and all of that. But Christians seem to be shying away from politics. What's your view on that? Would you advise Christians, looking at all that Africa wants to do, to be actively involved in the political dispensation of Africa now?
Absolutely. Again, I draw my spiritual and wisdom from the Bible. From Genesis to Revelation, every character in the Bible is a leader. Is a leader of a nation, is a judge, is a business person. Call anybody and I will show you what leadership means. Was it Joseph? He became a prime minister. Was it Abraham? He became a patriarch. Was it Daniel? Was it Samuel? Was it David? Was it Solomon? Was it Jeremiah? Was it Isaiah? Was it Paul? Was it Silas? All of these were leaders. Leaders of people leading them in a certain direction. One of the things that distinguishes us Christians, especially if they enter active politics, is the element of integrity, of wisdom, and lack of compromise. We draw our parallels from Daniel. If you look at Daniel, the Bible says that he distinguished himself above everything. There was nothing that you could touch.
10 times better.
Oh yeah. In terms of the way he ate, the way he dressed. He was living in a foreign land, a eunuch, a slave, but it was so pleasing to have him as one of the top rulers. And because of the way he lived, the Bible says he distinguished himself. He lived in a distinction. And therefore, right now, Africa has one of the worst examples of corruption, dishonesty, and the headlines are awash with theft. Yeah. And Africa is yearning for good leaders, people of integrity. Right. And I can say without consternation that my wife, who went into politics, is an example of one such leader. She has distinguished herself, and working with the local community has shown actually that you do not need to steal, but you need to work with excellence with whatever you have. And therefore, people feel so motivated and amiable to her. And the Bible says we are the salt of the earth. So I think that it's important that Christians and Christian leaders need to enter politics so that they bring the salt in education, in health, in ICT, in places of leadership, and they should ascend to the top echelons of power. Because once they are there, the Bible says when a righteous man leads a place, the city rejoices. When someone with an unrighteous person, there is mourning in the city. So those two elements is about light and darkness. We need to be able to bring light in an area, in business, in whatever sphere of influence. So it's very, very important that we should not shy away, because our forefathers, the Daniels, the Samuels, all the people, they are patriarchs, what they call the Hall of Fame in the book of Hebrews, were actually leaders in their own right, and they made a fundamental difference in the lives of the people they led.
Wonderful. So if I hear you right, what you are saying is that Africa right now needs more Christian, not just Christian leaders, but faith-based leaders, and not just politicians. Okay, this is wonderful. Mr. Asiimwe, that's the lead camera over there. And from what you have said so far, I know that you are very optimistic about the continent. Now you're talking about a continent that has a lot of young people, unemployment, and all of that, the issues that we've talked about. The private sector, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the Agenda 2063, and all of that. I want you to look at that camera and speak your heart to the continent. By 2050, by 2063, what we call the Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. What kind of Africa do you see? And what do you want to tell the youth, faith-based institutions, and the private sector? Please look in that camera and speak to them.
By 2063, my country will have hit the 90 million mark, and Africa will have passed the 3 billion population. It's very, very important that wherever you are as a young person, that you focus first. The Bible talks about seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be given unto you. What is your vision? What's your dream? Where do you want to see yourself as a young person by that time? From experience, whatever I wished for and dreamt, and it was very tough in the beginning, most, if not all of it, has come to pass. I'm now redefining my boundaries. And therefore, it's important that you harness that God-given talent and dream that you have got and be able to put it in practice, and everything will work towards you. I see an Africa that is transformed in technology, in infrastructure, in the way we do business, in the way we take advantage of opportunities. But most importantly, I see an Africa that is giving leadership to the rest of the world.
The private sector? And the private sector?
The private sector
very key.
Is very, very
within the context of
driving,
women and young people especially. Yes.
Yeah. And I encourage young people to get into the private sector, because once you have a talent and something that you have learned to put in practice, there's a big market for you. The opportunity is large. I think there is something for everybody. It's being able to fit into that area which you think and feel inspired to do. And I must say that we make mistakes, and I want to give you credit for that, because when we at the Private Sector Foundation had moved a certain distance, we found things were not moving. So we came back and we refreshed our strategy. And I must give you credit for having been part of that program. When you spoke to us about the kind of things that we need to look out for, we were then able to create a new strategy, which is now driving the agenda, that the things that I've been talking about. Yeah.
Well, it's been a great pleasure. And if you've been with us on this journey, what we are saying is that the Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, and the Africa Continental Free Trade Area are not policies that are just going to happen by itself. It's going to take Africans to be owned by Africans, driven by Africans. And all the institutions on the continent, particularly faith-based institutions, are going to be critical in ensuring that these things come to pass. It's not going to happen, like I said, just by praying. The time has come for us to stop praying with our minds and our mouth, and start praying with our legs and our hands, as somebody said. We believe as Human Capital International that Africa indeed is the future of the world. And that is why we are asking and inviting every African to be on the move, believe in God, trust Him that He will give you all the wisdom, all the ideas, so that together we can create the Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. Mr. Stephen Asiimwe, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Pleasure, and looking forward to 2063.
Absolutely.
When we shall be all people looking back about on the successes that we've done as a continent.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And congratulations for your work.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.